Hello, everyone, and welcome to this podcast where we will be discussing a report to be released soon by ENS on the relevance of environmental, social, and governance, or ESG for short, in Africa. I'm Celia Becker, an executive in the Africa Regulatory and Business Intelligence Department at the ENS, and I'm in conversation with Jessica Blumenthal and James Brand, two ESG specialists at ENS. Jessica and James, as advisors in Africa, we encounter a prevailing query as to the relevance of ESG in the African context. To answer this question, though, it's important to first understand what ESG means and seeks to achieve. James, do you mind giving us a broad overview of what ESG is all about and what it aims to achieve?
Yeah, sure. Hi, thanks, Celia. So I think it's important to first understand the origins of ESG and where it actually comes from to answer that question. And to many people's surprise, I think ESG was actually coined way back in 2004, so almost 20 years ago, in work done by the United Nations, and it began as an investment term to try and really shine a light on, as part of the investment inquiry, to try and flush out the considerations which apply as regards unforeseen risks and externalities that were not necessarily being priced into the investment analysis. For example, factoring in things like a carbon price and understanding whether this could have material impact on the risk weighting of an entity you're looking to invest in. And at more or less the same time that the UN was doing this work, about a year later, the UN commissioned the law firm Freshfields to consider whether there was any kind of fiduciary duty on the part of investors looking to take into account ESG factors. And in 2005, they released a report confirming that there was. So it was really these two reports in 2004, 2005 that kickstarted this ESG trend, I would say, and in particular as an investment concept that was primarily focused on risk. And it's really taking the learnings from the 2008 financial crisis, where we learned a lot in terms of what unforeseen risks can do to a systemic financial system. Back in 2008, those unforeseen risks related to subprime assets, and 15 years later, our financial sector has learned its lessons, and its regulators are wary of repeating the same kind of a mistake by not taking into account risks that are currently not priced or misunderstood or undisclosed, most notably climate change risk. So those businesses that understand this and are able to collate quality data and disclose and report on this allows investors to have a better handle on the potential risks of their investment. So it's a two-sided analysis, two sides of the same coin for this type of inquiry. So for financial institutions looking to allocate funding to ESG-aligned assets, it's important, but it's also relevant and important to businesses looking to attract sustainable finance. So if a business is ESG-aligned, it will enhance its ability to attract ESG-related finance.
Thanks, James. Very interesting. Jessica, with all of this in mind, why do you think there may have been initial pushback in some instances against an acceptance of this ESG mega trend on the African continent?
Well, Celia, it's because our context is just so different from that of the global north. So if we think about climate change and the impact of climate change on the planet, Africa's carbon emissions make up approximately 5% of global emissions, and this really seems immaterial when compared to the global emissions of developed nations. And if you break that down into a per capita measure, and we look at Africans on a per capita basis, Africans have the lowest emissions of citizens living on all continents. But despite that, we are still under the same pressure to steer away from the use of fossil fuels to be used to develop our economies. And of course, we need development of our economies because we're also behind on that score. So if you take a measure such as real access to electricity, in Africa, large parts of Africa are only at the point that the United States was at in the late 1890s when you look at real access to the electricity. So more than 40% of people living in Africa lack access to electricity, and 70% of them lack access to clean cooking. So against that context or that background, you can see that being asked to stay away from fossil fuel development opportunities seems a bitter pill to swallow, and especially when it is perceived to be pushed down by countries who've already had the benefit of development at a cost which is now being borne by the rest of us. And arguably, as developing nations, Africa and other developing nations, will disproportionately bear the cost of climate change due to our existing socioeconomic vulnerability. We also, of course, have a fast-growing population. So by 2030, which James mentioned that's in a sense the line in the sand that we all talk about all the time. But by 2030, Africa will be home to 1/5 of the world's population. And so we need to be able to provide access to modern energy for all these people, and keep pace with rising energy demands so that the economies can grow to ensure that the SDGs, at least as they relate to people, are able to be met. So you can see that prioritizing ESG can be perceived as prioritizing the environment, being very much a global north agenda, at least in some discourse, at the expense of energy security and poverty reduction in Africa. But of course, we can't just look at this from only an African perspective, and we can't be isolationist in our thinking. We need to take the broader context of the climate emergency into account. And we must also consider and make sure that we harness opportunities that are presented by the transition to a green economy that's being undertaken globally. So it would be terrible if Africa was left out of that or left behind. And that's why international negotiations and international conferences, such as that to be undertaken at COP, in a week or so's time, are so important. If we look particularly at climate mitigation, because of course we're talking about mitigation and adaptation when we talk about climate change and the development that's necessary in that regard. You can see how it might be really difficult for African leaders to allocate budget to climate change mitigation when that budget is needed to be directed towards things like basic service delivery, education, and healthcare. And it can also be really difficult for African governments to turn down opportunities in carbon-intense sectors, because of course those promise increased GDP and an opportunity to increase prosperity for the citizens of that country. Adaptation, despite Africa's minor contribution to global warming that I mentioned, is really important for us as a continent, because as I said, the great climate injustice is that our continent will suffer disproportionately the effects of climate change. We are incredibly vulnerable. The 2022 Climate Vulnerability Index identified Sub-Saharan Africa as home to 9 of the 10 most vulnerable countries in the world. So we really do need to ensure that we have built resilience through adaptation. But ESG is more than just climate change, and it does require consideration of a myriad of potentially material issues. So for example, corruption, that's something that really presents a significant challenge in Africa. And so that's something that we can't turn away from. We have to address the fact that Sub-Saharan Africa scores really low on transparency and governance ratings. And we need to consider this critical aspect of ESG within the African context to ensure that we are able to achieve prosperity for all citizens, particularly in light of our context, as I've said, with rampant inequality, underdeveloped economies, and facing the prospect of loss and damage from climatic events in future. So these are real challenges, but they are challenges that we need to address as a continent. And arguably, they are also challenges that should be on the agenda of the global community. And of course, that's why we'll all look closely at COP to see what the international community has to say around the promises that have been made in respect of supporting developing nations, African countries, in their adaptation and mitigation agenda.
Thanks, Jess. It makes me think of Winston Churchill, who is famously quoted as saying, "Never waste a good crisis." And very often, crisis and opportunity are two sides of the same coin. So, James, how can ESG potentially uncover opportunities that will almost inevitably arise as a result of this global shift to a more sustainable economy?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, Jess spoke about this global community, and that really is the case. And I think Africa has a significant role to play, obviously in uplifting its own populations, but also in terms of its contribution to the global commitments and the global goals set out in the Paris Agreement or the Global Biodiversity Framework, for example. And I think there are probably three, there are many, but there are three which are probably worth focusing on. I think the first is, Africa's critical minerals and rare earth elements, which are essential components or going to be increasingly essential components to a global transition to a net zero carbon future. And these types of extractive sectors and these types of minerals hold the key to much of the global ambition and push to mitigating harmful impacts of climate change that Jess mentioned. But to meet the SDG challenges that we spoke about earlier, the socioeconomic type challenges that are experienced in Africa, it's likely that Africa will need to transition away from a pit, mining pit to port type of operating, to a pit to production to port, to try and bring in those jobs and opportunities in the sense of extracting and then producing and then exporting, so that we can achieve the types of socioeconomic benefits we need to reach those SDG goals by 2030. I think the second resource and opportunity, let's say, to potentially touch base on relates to Africa's renewable resources. So we've got plenty untapped wind, solar, and hydropower in particular, which are abundantly available in Africa. And with the right domestic regulatory frameworks, and if we're able to unlock the financial mechanisms which are envisaged in the Paris Agreement and the Global Biodiversity Framework, which I mentioned earlier, these already harness these types of resources for great potential in Africa, both at a bulk supply level, but also at a decentralized level. And thirdly, because Africa has not been subjected to the same level of development as the developed North has, it now accounts for a significant 25% of the world's biodiversity, with large parts of key global ecosystems still intact in Africa. So protecting this biodiversity will play a key critical role in Africa's part towards contributing to global efforts to preserve our biodiversity, which is important for Africa, but also for the greater global community that I mentioned. For example, the Congo Basin is the largest carbon sink in the world and absorbs more carbon, I understand, than the Amazon, for example. So it's important for all of us, not just the people in Africa, but the global community, to have this type of key biodiversity area protected going forward. Both the Paris Agreement and the Global Biodiversity Framework that I mentioned earlier establish mechanisms to allow for international finance to be redirected towards nature and climate positive outcomes. So there's great potential for African entities that can disclose and demonstrate their contribution to environmental or social imperatives, and who can innovate solutions to address the very many challenges we face both globally, but as well as here in Africa.
Thanks, James. So I think if we turn a bit more specifically to the ENS report that's underway, so leveraging of ENS offices in 7 different African countries, as well as our extensive network of collaborating law firms, the recent report sought to identify the key ESG developments across sub-Saharan Africa in selected countries, and focuses on anticipating the development of international legislation with potential cross-border effect, corporate disclosures, and also directors' duties and corporate responsibilities for ESG-related considerations at a domestic level. This is certainly a complex and evolving space, and it seems that African companies and multinationals with African operations need to very carefully navigate this sphere and need assistance to do so. And I would just imagine that reports such as ours can only scratch the surface of the requirements, and it's best to take specific advice tailored to a company's own circumstances.
Absolutely. So what we found in our work throughout the continent is that no two matters are the same. So while we have conducted several board workshops in different sectors, we've done training with boards, the burning questions facing those boards are always different. And this makes sense given how wide and nuanced the ESG inquiry can be. I mean, just from our discussion today, you can see how many directions it could go in. So the issues facing a financial institution will not be the same as those facing a corporate in the petroleum sector or a fishery, for example. At ENS, we've been working through our ESG department to ensure that our multidisciplinary and cross-jurisdictional team are able to provide context-specific advice, because as we've discussed today, context is very important, which is informed both by local circumstances and the local developments that we've been talking about, but also by international best practice, because as we've said, like it or not, we are all in this together.
Thanks, Jessica, James. This was really very useful, and I'm sure our clients will also find it very interesting. So yeah, please look out for our publication on why ESG is relevant in Africa, which will be published shortly. Thank you.
Thanks, Celia.
Thanks, Celia.